So good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Again, my name is Sheldon Penoyer. I'm president of AIA New Hampshire, and welcome to this afternoon session. First, as I say at all of these, is we have to thank our sponsors because, again, this can't happen without them. So thank you goes to Marvin Window and Doors, Duke Construction Corporation, the Macmillan Company, Colby Windows and Doors, Clearly Millwork, Milestone Engineering and Construction, Procon, and Selectwood. So we are bringing together all the morning speeches to you to take part in a conversation led by Emily Grandstaff Rice, FAIA. Emily is an architect with 16 years of experience on a broad range of academic, hospitality, institutional, and commercial projects. Her leadership includes serving as 2014 president of the Boston Society of Architects and chairing the AIA Equity and Architecture Commission in 2016. Emily's innovative design work reinforces that a building is more than its shell. It is an experience. As a frequent speaker and writer on the future of architectural practice, Emily is fascinated by how technology and social economy and environmental urgency are addressed in Arrow Street's practice. Emily was recently elected to the AIA National Board of Directors. Her term begins in 2018. We are recording this session, so if you have any questions or you're going to speak, please make sure that you get a microphone. One will be handed out to you. At the conclusion of this conversation at 2:30, we will break for a few moments before the tours start. Please come to the hotel lobby at 2:45, which is out in the front. Some of you will be leaving on a shuttle bus to your tour locations. The tour Portsmouth above and below will leave the hotel on foot. We will not reconvene after the tours, but we invite you to enjoy the rest of your afternoon in Portsmouth. And just one last announcement too is there is a sheet going around for the learning unit, so please, if you want your credits, sign up on the sheet. And now to Emily.
Thank you. Thank you. And these are health, safety, welfare, so those are like a hot commodity. All AIA members know that. Thank you for having me on this beautiful Saturday afternoon. And what's amazing about this is that we get to talk about a very important topic, resilience, but also how this affects our practice. And with us are, as you know, 4 leaders in this topic, but leaders in a different way, which I find this assemblage of this panel here so extraordinary. So very quickly, I'm going to put you to task immediately. Can you give us a brief introduction of who you are? And don't forget, tell me what you would have been doing if you weren't here on this panel. So Sheldon introduced me, so I'll tell you what I would have been doing. I would have been at the under-8 girls soccer team, Huskies versus Otters. And I don't know who wins because we don't keep score.
Well, all right. So my name is Dr. Atia Martin. I'm the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Boston. We are part of 100 Resilient Cities, which was started by the Rockefeller Foundation. And we are one of 23 cities around the United States that are part of that network, and we're one of 100 around the world. Our resilience strategy focuses on racial equity and social justice, especially relationships between people, as part of our overall thinking around resilience. So we've embedded it into infrastructure, into the way we think about economic resilience, social resilience, a whole range of all the different domains of resilience. And so for me, what I would have been doing had I not been here, there are probably 3 possibilities. One, I could have been on another panel somewhere else, which oftentimes happens. 2, I would have been hanging out with my 2 youngest kids because they still think I'm cool enough to hang out with. Or I'd probably say 3, I would have been doing something having to do with the nonprofit and business my husband and I do on the side. So one of those 3 possibilities.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Lindsay Brugger. I manage AIA's Resilience and Adaptation Program, as well as their Disaster Assistance Program at AIA National. So that means my role includes creating tools, resources, education, and policy recommendations to really move the profession forward and tackle the shocks and stresses that really prevent our communities from thriving. Had I not been here today, I would probably be home cooking. I love to cook, or maybe taking a nap with my dog on the couch.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Atley, and I actually work in the material health and transparency space, not in the resiliency space. So right now I'm working for Proseco, a manufacturer out of Lawrence, Kansas. And I am here not in my professional capacity, but really in my capacity as a citizen and activist. I am involved with Mothers Out Front, the Springfield Climate Justice Coalition, and also SURGE, which is Showing Up for Racial Justice, which I didn't mention before. And that's what I do in my available time between family, I have a 5-year-old, and work, and it's because that's where my passion is, so I'm here because of my passion. And if I wasn't here right now, I would probably be hanging out with my sick 5-year-old.
My name's Alex Wilson. I'm founder and president of the Resilient Design Institute in Brattleboro, Vermont. It's a nonprofit I launched 5 years ago to advance resilience in the built environment and at a community scale. I also founded 30-some years ago the company Building Green to work on publishing information and doing consulting on sustainability in the built environment. That company is a 15-person company based in Brattleboro. It's now run by Nadav Maleen. If I wasn't here today, I would have gotten a head start in putting in a foundation for a chicken coop I'm building at our farm in Dummerston, Vermont, which will be a longer day tomorrow because of it, trying to get that in before snow flies.
Excellent. So we're going to flip this a little bit. I know that each of the panelists gave a talk earlier. I want to start with your questions. So from what you heard from the 2 sessions this morning, do you have a question that you want to address to the panel starting off? Because if not, I do. And then I get to choose. Yeah. Sheldon's got it. Awesome.
I think one of the biggest challenges in resilience and sustainability is the nature of people and their social organizations, social boundaries and jurisdictions. What is the AIA and other people, all of you, what are you all doing to cross those boundaries, to try to flatten the hierarchies in order to really get to think integratively about being resilient?
So I'm going to ask Dr. Martin and then maybe Jennifer to address those first, and then I'll have Alex and Lindsay follow up with that.
I knew that was coming. So I think in several ways. So I think when we understand what it means to actually change, to try to get to facilitate change, to that change management process, there's a series of phases that we have to go through, right? We have to make sure people understand that we have a problem. It's like AA steps, right? It's like, I have a problem, and it is social injustices. And for Boston, we focus on issues around racism and what that means for how it impacts our lives. How do we help people develop the skills that they need in order to do something about it in a way that's connected to community? So a lot of the initiatives, a lot of the events that we do are very much embedded with arts and culture. We're always trying to think about creative ways to bring lots of different stakeholders together. So our entire process, we engaged over 11,000 people in Boston, businesses, nonprofits, foundations, all the city departments and cabinet heads, community members, real community members, not just the grass tops. As well as the grass tops, and bringing folks together to collectively to co-design, co-problem solve around how we put the strategy together. So the entire strategy was really crowdsourced in that way. And then the final decisions on, well, which initiatives and all those pieces, we did that with a smaller group that we call the Boston Resilience Collaborative, which is just over 100 experts in community across all those different stakeholders, and then we broke them up into working groups based on the crowdsourced priorities that came out. And then they basically came up with the vision areas, the goals. They helped us think through which initiatives. They made a lot of recommendations that we had to scale back. We were like, okay, we're going to need you to kind of, no, we can't give the planning department. So, yeah, that's not going to happen. And so in Boston, it's the planning and development. It's like all the same. And there's lots of resentment around some of the things that have happened because that's the case. But at any rate, so we were very intentional to leverage the resilience strategy process as a way to model addressing issues of social equity and social injustices, but also building relationships and showing like government can do things differently. We don't have to do the starchy kind of bland things that nobody wants to come to, right? And so that's one layer. The other layer I'll say very quickly is helping people to shift culture and thinking around these issues. I find that a lot of times people don't want to really deal with issues of social justice, especially racism, because the research is very, very explicit that it makes us have a physiological reaction when people just say the word. And you've already created like discomfort and barriers. And so getting folks more comfortable with that by reframing what it means and how we talk about it has been a really powerful part of that, and to see how it's relevant to their particular organizations and institutions or their fields, their spheres of influence. So that's really been an important part of our work, and how do we move the needle forward? As I lied. The last thing is the institutional piece, and how do we get within government for us to do the work we need to do around internal racial equity? What is it that we're doing to be explicit around how do we not have disproportionate negative impacts in communities of color by the decisions that we're making, and how do we advance racial equity? And how do we help other sectors to be asking those same questions as they're doing the work too?
So Jennifer, I see an immediate tie-in between some of the advocacy work that you do and community organizing.
Yeah, definitely. And what I was thinking about talking to was the concept of social solidarity, which is around how do we recognize the needs that other groups have and support those needs as well, instead of just the piece of trying to get everybody on our bandwagon. And it may not directly relate to what you were asking, Ludmilla, but it's the long-term piece of bringing ourselves in relationship to the point where we can actually come from a place of trust and be able to say, all right, look, this is what we're working on, can we get help with this? And because it's coming from a place of, I can already say, I'm helping you, we have that kind of relationship. In our area, there's an organizers roundtable, which is from, individuals from a whole wide range of groups, and it's around how, having conversations around how they can support each other. So it's building that network.
So I'll just add a little bit here, since you mentioned AIA specifically. There are two sides of that I can speak to. One is the Communities by Design program, which are the design assistance teams, so the RUDATs, SDATs, and actually DARTs as well. And those are participatory design processes. So communities apply for these programs. They are pro bono design services, but the team, which is an interdisciplinary team, is invited to the community. So that's step one. The community has to want us there.
I just want to do a gut check. Does everyone know what a RUDAT or an SDAT is? Okay, so RUDAT is Regional Urban Design Assistance Team, and an SDAT is a Sustainable Design Assistance Team. And basically, if you're a community that would like to kickstart some action and have architects come in and help brainstorm with you, you can apply for this program, and it is funded on behalf by the AIA.
Correct. Thank you for that.
I don't know what the third one stands for, so you'll have to explain that.
Yes, so that's the resiliency version.
Thank you.
Of the SDAT. To your point, Jennifer, and really having it be the grassroots piece, because we're invited, the community is already beginning to feel invested. And then we work through a participatory design process where we hear both the challenges and opportunities from the local experts, which are those that live there. And a lot of times that process is validating their ideas. It helps to have outsiders come in and say, you know what, no, that really is a good idea. I know some others in the community maybe don't agree with you, but here's why we as experts from outside your community think it's a good idea. Or we might bring expertise from across the country and say, this problem is very similar to what we've seen over here. Here's an opportunity. So that's a way to address kind of the social grassroots side of things. But from an institutional side that I want to talk to as well is AI has coalesced, along with NIBS, the National Institute of Building Sciences, a resilience building statement. And it's a statement of 5 principles that we're trying to get the industry behind and to move the industry forward. So this is now, it was completed in 2014, and it had about 20 initial signatories. It's now up to over 40. And the signatories are organizations from across the design gamut. So they include owners like BOMA. It includes construction managers, architects, landscape designers, also facility managers. I know at lunch we were really talking that it's great to build this really robust, smart building, but how do we ensure that it's operated in that way and that it just doesn't go back to what's normally done or has been done for the past 50 years. So that's all part of change management, and getting all the different facets of the design industry on board with this discussion and with these goals is what's going to help make that happen.
So I'm curious, is there any measures in place to make sure that the RUDATs and the SDATs and the resiliency acronym are accessed equitably across the country? Because I'm curious, I'm assuming the communities come because they know about it, but is there also outreach to see if there's inclusion for the communities who might not be aware of this happening?
That's a great question, and because I don't manage that program, I can't really speak accurately to that question.
Okay, so I have some work to do.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Good stuff. Yeah. And then I want to make sure.
So just as we also think about programs that are going into communities, to always look for opportunities to prep folks to go into communities in terms of what bias that we might be bringing with us so that we can actually see all that the community has to offer. And I know sometimes it can be scary and uncomfortable and all that other stuff to, again, talk openly about these things. But in order for us to make the kind of transformative changes that we need in communities and in our institutions and in our own personal lives, we have to be able to have the humility to say, you know what, we all have bias. It colors the way that we navigate the world, the way that we see the situation, and without expanding our boundaries and understanding that, but also allowing ourselves the space to see the world a little bit differently, then we miss huge opportunities. And so just as teams are going in to look for opportunities to kind of embed that into the programming.
Absolutely.
So I just wanted to add that a lot of resilience has to do with how we design our buildings and lay out our towns and cities, but a lot has to do with building community as well. And I mentioned this morning that your first responder is often your next door neighbor. So we in the resilience space need to figure out how do we get people to get to know their neighbors better so that they can be interdependent on one another. And that's a bigger challenge than the technical part of creating more resilient buildings and lay out more resilient communities. And we worked on that to some extent. I say we scratched the surface in some work with enterprise community partners in New York City on a resilience project for multifamily affordable housing, where we saw huge differences in the response to Superstorm Sandy, where one affordable housing project would self-organize and work together and get food up to people that couldn't evacuate, and really worked like clockwork by working together. Others, sort of sat back and waited for FEMA or the city to come rescue them. And so what can we as architects and designers do to make that former scenario more likely? And there's some aspects of building design that relate to that. creating in our multifamily buildings community spaces where people interact by virtue of doing their laundry or getting their mail or walking their dogs, and whatever it is, getting people together to, to get to know each other. And then when a disaster happens and people need to pull together to, to solve those problems, they're more likely to do so. But that's a big challenge, and we have a ways to go in figuring out the strategies to make that more likely.
That's such an important point. It reminds me, Vivek Murthy, the former Surgeon General, just wrote an article in Harvard Business Review about the loneliness epidemic, right? And it's becoming a public health issue, the interconnectedness. So I live in Somerville, Massachusetts, and when the power goes out, which it does during the summer, thank you very much, all of the neighbors kind of go out and congregate in the street. And we go to whoever's house is brightest based on their solar lights. That's because of a function of the street that I live on, and you make those connections. I know of other streets in Somerville where someone doesn't know that there's school kids living 5 houses down from them, right? So it's on all of us to make those connections, both personally, but also professionally. Us as architects have such an important role to play in the day-to-day, but also in the social fabric of creating the larger built environment.
I have one more piece.
Yeah, of
It'll be
course.
really quick. I
Oh,
promise.
stop apologizing. Keep
It'll
going.
be
Keep going.
quick. And I think the other piece to balance this out, because we know these are complicated issues, and so we need sophisticated strategies that have multiple layers in them. So we have the relationships of people in the immediate area, right? But part of our challenge is that we're so segregated, not just racially, but financially and in so many different ways, that we create these silos of social networks that look like us. And the issue with that is when you've been living in intergenerational poverty because of the policies and practices that this country has had historically and still presently, you don't have connections to people who know how to navigate certain things. And so if your network is just what's around you, then your opportunity and access to things is very limited, because the way our society works is based on relationships. It's the way that it's our strength, and it's the thing we have to build, but it's on the other side, it's also the thing that can be very harmful when the social networks are so segregated in the ways that they currently are. So the importance that you just of building outside of our normal networks, the connections to the built environment, as well as kind of dealing with the social inequities and social injustices that we have in our own role in potentially perpetuating systems of oppression.
Excellent point. So I'll throw it back out to you. Is there another question out there?
So I'll ask one.
Please, Sheldon.
So, we've been talking about a lot of topics today relative to, do you want me to stay?
Yeah, you're the one holding the mic.
We've been talking about a lot of topics today about resiliency, and in many of our minds, resiliency means the ability to bounce back. And we talk about many topics related to us as human beings and what that means in resiliency. We talk about buildings and what we do to design buildings. But one of the things that I keep struggling with is how we are going to figure out how to pay for these things. Our tax structure gets farther and farther and farther away from being able to bring equity, being able to create good neighborhoods. So I'd love to hear from all of you sort of your thoughts on how we might have to become resilient to deal with this inevitable change that keeps coming our way.
Yeah, I'm going to throw this one to Alex and Lindsay first.
It's a great question. How do we pay for these enhancements to make us more resilient? I think if we had the answer to that, we'd be a lot further along. I think there are ways that we can engage the insurance industry and the lending institutions to address resilience and begin offering discounted insurance rates for more resilient buildings, offer preferential interest for mortgages when buildings are more resilient, And then I think we need to look at the way we fund disaster recovery. And, you mentioned bouncing back, that's the way we think of it, and that's the way FEMA treats it. You put back what was there before. But we need to be bouncing forward with response to disasters and not put back what was there, but put back something stronger and more resilient. And, that costs even more money, but it becomes an investment. If we build back something stronger, we're unlikely to have to spend that same amount of money 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road. So it takes a different attitude about long-term investments in community, and convincing the electorate to support that in taxes is really hard. If we look at some of the Scandinavian countries, they have these really high tax rates, and we say not in America. But those taxes pay for health care, they pay for education, they pay for sort of the social infrastructure, in these support networks. Maybe we need to, pursue something like that here.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for that great question. The most cost-effective way, in my mind, to reduce risk and enhance your resiliency is really to think about where you're building. If you build in an area that has less risk, that building is going to cost less both to build and to maintain. For those areas that do have risk, we need to think about mitigation. A NIBS, Multi-Hazard Mitigation Council, so NIBS is the National Institute of Building Sciences, they had a study that came out and essentially said that for every dollar spent in mitigation, you save $4 in recovery. They're redoing that study right now, and they expect that number to go up, because that was actually just based on federal investments, and their new study will include the private sector. So thinking about how we can incentivize mitigation, Alex mentioned FEMA. FEMA has a great disaster deductible policy that is out right now that I hope will be adopted. And what that's saying is we are going to charge the states. They have to meet a certain threshold before we will give them their recovery dollars. But if they do X, Y, Z mitigation strategies, that deductible will go down. So they're incentivizing the states to invest locally in mitigation, which will hopefully result in fewer impacts after a disaster.
So it sounds like money talks. So how do we get not just owners and architects to do this, but cities?
Oh, you're looking at me. So part of the challenge is that most cities are, in terms of their normal operating dollars, are pretty constrained. Massachusetts is a home rule state, like many of us in New England. But what that people think that means, you have all this freedom to do whatever you want. Well, it's actually a huge resource waste, right? Because you have 351 cities and towns that have their own public health, their own police, their own, keep going, right? No matter how tiny or big they are, even if it's just like a part-time person who's wearing all of those hats, it's all isolated and siloed. And so I think there's efficiencies that we can leverage. I think the other part is to not see this as a what's the government doing, and what are you over here doing, and what are you guys over there doing, and figuring out how do we break down some of the silos and think more collaboratively on solutions, right? So the public-private partnership is the way we do a lot of things, because government has limited money, very limited, especially in Boston, because of our tax base. I mentioned this in the talk, but 60% of the property in Boston is owned by nonprofits, so we're not getting taxes on those properties, and that's our primary source of income. So our budget is really only about $2 billion total for a pretty large city. We're a small city, but we're a big city. And so that means that we have to be more creative around, this is going to be duplicative, creative financing models, and how we think about public-private partnerships, how we think about bonds, and how we think about pay-for-success models, and all these things that are out there, but not just for government, but thinking about what does it mean when we're making investments in large development projects in the city. Is there a way that we can tap into that to also think about, well, while we're here doing this, are there some other benefits that we can generate off of that experience, whether it's, well, the developer agrees to create space for communities to congregate in there, that the community actually decides on what that actually is going to look like. You know, those types of things. Or from a public health perspective, you know, they agree to make sure, or actually from a sustainability perspective as well, like they agree to have healthy housing that doesn't harm the people who are living there, but more importantly, I shouldn't say more importantly, but parallel to that, we're also looking at, well, and it will be a green building and sustainable and all that other stuff, but really kind of connecting the dots across the issue areas and across the sectors, because it is a shared problem, and not government can't fix it, private sector can't fix it, no one can fix it in isolation. But if we're thinking about how we can pool our resources together and think more creatively about things, that's usually where we get the, you know, the best magic that happens, that we've seen around the country in those pockets of excellence where we're seeing things and we're like, that's really cool. Yeah. If you look under the covers of it, it's really about cross-sector collaboration, people putting their money where their mouth is, but also the process matters sometimes more than the outcomes, and making sure that the process actually was inclusive and that folks felt like they were in it the whole way.
So I don't know if you know, I'm involved with the Brook Charter High School in Mattapan. And I can say from firsthand experience, it has been a process. But it's a good process, right? And we meet with the CAC every month. And we did the BPDA and all that stuff, so it's working.
Awesome.
It's working.
Pocket of excellence.
You know, it's about partnerships. Right. Exactly right.
So 2 things. We're talking about connecting the dots. One of the dots that I would love to see connected is between the community of practitioners who's involved with the New Economy Coalition and the community of practitioners who's involved particularly with the high performance buildings and the green building community. And this is because it's a community of practitioners who is involved with how do we reset this economic system in a way that actually funnels resources towards communities and towards where it can be used effectively, and looking at that more of a holistic picture, but from the economic side. And I really do think that the challenges that I see coming up in this field, where we're so creative around how do you do buildings and how do you do design, but then get stuck on the economics so much, when there's this whole other community of practitioners who is really looking at how do we do things creatively on the economic side, that there might be some really amazing synergies between those groups. So that's one thing. And just a few examples of that. So Ujima project, you know?
Ujima, I'm a member, and they're featured in the City of Boston's Resilient Strategy.
Can you describe Ujima project?
Sure. Ujima project is a co-op of folks from the community who agreed to pool their money to make investments in organizations and projects within the community. And so it's anyone can join and participate at different levels, but ultimately it's about how to leverage the power of the community and other allies to support businesses and initiatives, whether real estate opportunities within the community. And it takes a participatory process approach to it. So that means that the folks who are members and part of the community are also democratically and equitably making decisions about who gets what. And no matter how much money you contribute, you only get one vote. And the other part of it is it's also community development approach, because they're also building up the knowledge, skills, and capacity of community members and organizations to understand these financial structures, what it means, what it looks like, and what they're actually investing their money in.
Yeah, thank you. So imagine if your clients was the community who had decided to invest in you along with whatever their community project is to create something that was for the benefit of that community, and then the financial resources go back to the community for that, instead of a developer who you're pushing and pulling to try to get to even think about these things. So that's the level of change that we can see if we start realizing that we can plant these seeds.
Yep, flipping the model, making it bigger. So I'm just to bounce off of Sheldon's question a little bit. I know that there are some small practitioners here in the room, and we're talking about big ideas. So what would your message be to someone running a small business somewhere in New England? Because we're 6 states here. how could they take their own personal or organizational responsibility to advance the topics that we've been talking about today?
And you're looking at me again.
You're just closest. I'm
Okay.
so sorry. Who wants to take this? I'll open it.
I can take it. I think one of the opportunities is to make the case that building a very energy efficient, passive solar, naturally ventilated building is a safety strategy. It's not just doing the right thing. It's not just an environmental strategy. It's a resilient strategy that can keep those building occupants safer if there's a power outage. And that can be a selling point. I believe that argument is often easier for a client to accept than, oh, do this because you'll help the environment. It makes it a sort of a self-interest thing, a safety thing, keep your family safe, keep your school children safe, and ultimately the strategies are the same, to create a green building for environmental reasons or to create a resilient building for protection against vulnerabilities, but the sell can be easier, I believe. So I think, presenting that to the client, that, build a net zero energy home or school and do it for these resilience reasons.
I love how you talked about earlier that you have shifted your career a little bit, and not in purpose, but in focus post-Katrina, because you found resiliency to be almost an easier sell.
Yeah. I mean, we've become so politicized in this country, the red state, blue state. In some parts of the country, you can't even mention sustainability. You get attacked as this UN Agenda 21 conspiracy. But resilience has common interest everywhere from, my experience. There's the right wing wants to be self-sufficient. They don't want a government having to protect them. They want to, be able to support themselves. And so resilience can play in that group. So, I like to push resilience, across the political spectrum. It's not just a Democratic thing or a blue state thing. So I think it's a way to, it's a different motivation that can achieve the same thing, but for a different reason.
Yeah. How many people here participate in LEED systems? Yeah, enough. So LEED rating system, right? So you have some pilot credits that are coming out next week?
Well, that's a good question and a longer story. We developed pilot credits for the LEED rating system on resilient design. Those came out 2 years ago, and they were available for a year. We got a lot of input based on, several dozen projects that went through that certification using those pilot credits. And we took that information and have strengthened the pilot credits. There's still determination of when those are going to be released, or if not, what would replace them. But I'm confident that the work that the resilience working group of the U.S. Green Building Council spent a year on since those pilot credits were taken down will come to fruition with really good information and guidance to help design teams create more resilient buildings.
Excellent.
And if I could add to your question, Emily, and I'm going to stretch the definition from resilience to include disaster preparedness, because especially for small firms, you got to start at home. You need to create a business continuity plan. 40% of small businesses close after a disaster. And you're of no help to your clients and your community if you can't keep your doors open. So I think that's really for small businesses the takeaway and where you need to begin. As far as designing in a resilient way for your clients, it's like any other project. You need to just define what your parameters are. Find out what your local hazard risks are. Find out what your climate risks are, and have that discussion with your client.
It's almost like, I hate when people say this, but like, what's going to happen if I get hit by a bus, right? What's going to happen if your business gets hit by a bus or a hurricane or an earthquake or a tsunami or whatever? be prepared.
And I just wanted to add that just as we think about resilience, one of the things is it does include disaster preparedness, right? Like that's part of, the big picture resilience, not just climate resilience. And I think as we think about when we're having these conversations around resilience, if we think on the front end, we're talking about the day-to-day situations, like the fact that we could get hit by a bus and you could get hit by an earthquake or a hurricane or whatever, and that the relationship between the day-to-day operations of an organization and how that will be impacted when disasters happen, and that you can kind of pretty much predict what those impacts are going to be. So when we think about how we structure our small businesses, one of the things that on the equity side is to also think about what our mission and vision actually says about us, what our principles are, because that when the world gets fast-paced and crazy and your business is starting to grow, as a small business owner myself, you have to you don't have time to like figure that stuff out. It becomes your anchor to kind of filter through the world that's flying at you at crazy speed. And so having a strong vision, having a strong mission, and being clear about what your values are, and making sure that equity is part of your values, and resilience, and how that connects to the priorities around how you're going to prepare your organization for emergencies, how you're going to connect with the community around you as part of that community, and figure out what are the strengths there that you can tap into that will also help you in your day-to-day operations, but also when there's emergencies. And so kind of just thinking a little bit bigger picture and connecting the dots to the whole organization and how we think about it, and embedding it throughout the organization, in the identity of the organization.
So I'm going to throw it out to the audience. Any questions? Okay. Yes.
We just ask about, we're talking about small things, but what about, are we looking at an economic reset globally? When we talk about resiliency, and to land on Sheldon, how you're paying for this. I mean, we're dancing around it, but I think that's what we're talking about. And are we developing the tools to have the power to act on those things? Because we're a service-based industry. So are we looking at a globally reset economic system?
I have some opinions. I'll let the...
You can take it.
Yeah. I think we are. I think, so there's a lot of architects, American architects, that work globally, especially in how the structure of many large firms work. And I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that we are our own island as the United States of America. And there's so much interdependency. And you can think of it also in terms of when the price of materials goes up and down, right? If there's something going on with China, with steel, we feel it. We feel it economically. So you can get it from Canada for a little bit, but there's only so much going around. Mm-hmm. And I think the bigger issue is if you take COP21 and some of the work that has been happening globally, it's disheartening, the immediate US response to that. And I don't know what the breaking point is going to be. I guess I feel a little uncertainty because, yeah, I think we are at a global breaking point, but I don't know what it's going to take for the full-on meltdown for us to get together and really go forward. But climate change is real, it's happening, and I hate to say it, it might take a couple more disasters for us to really kick into action. Or actually, I'm going to throw this to Jennifer, because she wrote a great article on regional resilience, I tweeted it out this morning. I've been doing a lot of research this morning. If anybody wants to follow the tweets, AIANE2017 is the hashtag that I've been following you all on. Creating regional resilience in New England. Can you speak to bringing regional groups together? I mean, the question was global, but I'm going to throw it to you because you have experience in that.
Well, I might actually take it to a global level.
I'll ask you to use the mic. Yeah.
Yeah, so the article was a 2014 article, and it was a group of transition towns groups, which is around resiliency, coming together and say, oh, a lot of these issues are not local. And this is, a group that's really focused on local resilience and relocalizing, really from an agrarian perspective, less of the city perspective. And they were coming together and realizing, okay, so our food systems, our financial systems, climate migration, there's all sorts of ways you can go on and on. Our supply chains are all global. So one of the things that we were looking at is how do you take those to a more regional level? So one of the things, there's a concept of subsidiary, which is what is the scale at which something can effectively be controlled, and what is the sort of the most intimate level at which that can be controlled, and trying to move things to that space. So for instance, can you really address supply chains at a local level? No. Manufacturing at a local level? No. So what is the level at which you can start to pull some of that in to increase your resiliency? So that's really the flavor of that article, but I want to talk about something else.
Yeah.
I want to highlight a book, which is my new favorite book, which is called Change for the Audacious, A Doer's Guide. And this is really looking at how do we do large-scale systems change. And it talks a lot about dynamics and networks. So one of the things that I've gotten involved with the author is around emerging governance networks, which is really looking at sort of taking public-private partnerships to a totally different level and way of thinking, which is really recognizing that where the positive change that's happening right now is coming from is like you were saying, it's coming out of having NGOs and government and citizens directly and whatever I'm missing, private,
All that stuff.
all of these different groups working together much more intimately to solve problems because the challenges that we're facing are just so much more complex than we can solve by any one industry alone. So breaking down those silos is really how we're going to make it happen. And this is a great, there's plenty of resources, but this is a great practical guide to what are some of the tools to making that happen.
I'm trying to tweet this out without the Amazon link. I found it. Anyone else want to take that on?
I'll just add one more piece that I don't know if it's necessarily deconstructing everything and starting from scratch per se, so much as it's how do we, so there's multiple levels, right? Because there's plenty of money floating around, right? It's not like there's not a lot of money out there. So part of it is how do we refocus the way that we're leveraging the different pockets of money that's working on these issues. I think the other part is how do we change our thinking and perspective on the issues? And I think one of the things that we talked about in my session was kind of a lot of the ways that climate change and racism are alike. And I know that sounds crazy to some people, but they are in some ways, and mostly in what people don't believe about them. Like people don't believe that it's a real thing, right? So there are people who don't believe that either of them are real. There are people who don't believe that either of them have anything to do with them. There are people who believe that there's really not a whole lot we can do about it. And there are people who believe that there's really I think that there's a barrier between them and the issue, right? Like we've created these almost false dichotomies, right, around these issues where you either sit on the side if you believe in it or not, you're a racist or not, and it's these, but it's not connected to the way the world actually works and how it's actually happening in our country or around the world, both racism and climate change. And the reason I bring it up that way is because if we keep using the same ways of thinking to deal with the issues, we're going to keep making the same silly mistakes. We're going to keep doing the same things. And we're trying to get away from that. And so I think part of this is also about a shift in our thinking and the way we approach these issues. And these are personal issues. All of us are contributing to these issues. All of us are helping the issues in some ways. And so how can we get more conscious about what that means in our own lives, in our own organizations and institutions, and how we can collectively invest in, not because it's a good or right thing to do, but because there's a business case for both climate change and equity issues, right? businesses who address the issues head on and are diverse make more money, they do better. They produce better products and services, right? On the other side, when we look at climate change, when folks are really taking these issues head on, they get a lot of recognition for this, right? They get accolades for this work. They get more attention. They get more clients. They get more customers, which are the same thing as clients. That's why I need some caffeine in the afternoon. At any rate, but I'll just end by saying that so there's this fundamental piece around the frameworks that we use to think about these issues that are in our way of seeing the bigger picture in ways that we can leverage all of the resources we currently have better, and how to come up with some creative ways to get new things infused into that new way of thinking, new money, new people, new resources.
Excellent. So I love that someone has the Twitter handle cynical feeling. You've made my day. Okay, so question from the audience. Okay.
So I'm going to push the question that I asked earlier a little farther.
Yeah.
And what I see would make a big difference to resiliency is when we think about affordable housing and we think about neighborhoods, it's home ownership. We happen to live in a country where property ownership is a big part of what we do, and yet I think a lot of the neighborhoods that are less fortunate don't have that. So as you begin to think about these larger scale projects that we see in architecture, I struggle because a lot of them don't seem to be encouraging the idea of home ownership. They're solving a problem. They're putting a roof over somebody's head, and yes, it makes a nice space and it's got some nice light, but to me, home ownership seems to be a really critical part of resiliency because you've got people invested in their neighborhoods and in their communities. And so how do we do that? Because of what I said before, our taxation structure doesn't allow this. How do we think about how we invest in those neighborhoods? Do we build these structures and then find a way to turn it into private ownership? Is that something that any of you on the panel think has merit?
I have something just right immediately is just in terms of the framing of the question, right? So there's an assumption that in communities where people are struggling, that folks aren't investing in their communities, but they are, right? There are people who've been living there for 30 years, and they're not homeowners, but they've been long-time renters. And in most cities, the majority of the population are renters. And so being able to reframe to be about wealth is a different question, right? Because the purpose of home ownership is wealth, right? It's a place where we live, yes, but it's also the major source of all of our wealth to be able to start a business, send kids to school, like all of those things. We derive that from our home. And so for renters, what are the other ways that they can build wealth to be able to address some of those gaps? Because the wealth gap is the biggest gap we have in this country across the board and by race, right? And so, and I think the other part, the issue of kind of community, how architects can help communities be more invested in themselves, I think is about how we design space that creates opportunities for people to actually be connected. There's actually, I'm not going to remember because it's not my field, so I apologize. But we did a Design for Equity conference last year in Boston with a bunch of stakeholders and partners. And one of the big things that folks talked about was all of these different models for ways to design for community building. And so there's stuff out there, and there are people who are thinking about this stuff who are like way down the road than many of us are. And so tapping into that knowledge and resource. And then the last thing I'll say is, as we think about the big challenges kind of in communities and opportunities for architects and for planners and designers, I think there's a huge opportunity for one of the recommendations that I talked about in our workshop, which was how do we personalize the issue, right? Like part of the reason we keep spinning our wheels on things is because we've separated ourselves. When we say the community, we're not talking about us, right? But all of us are part of a community. And it's just an interesting way of framing the world, because if you don't see it as you, then it seems like this foreign thing that you have to figure out, like, so then, like, how do we talk to them? And then, like, and it's just like, well, they're just like you and your community, so the same way you would do for yourself, or the same way you would want it to happen. So just reframing some of the approaches, and this is not a direct response to your question, this part, but really thinking about what does this mean for me in my life as I am a community member too, and what would I want to see, and not in terms of in replacement for community, engaging with communities, but just in thinking about what are the principles that we go into communities with, and how do we connect with people on a deeper level who most times don't look like us, especially if you're doing work in communities that have been marginalized, and being able to not be afraid to accept the humility that comes with the fact that we are flawed human beings, and that we make judgments of other people, but we can manage it if we have the skills and tools and knowledge to do so. But that before we go into communities, that we're checking ourselves to be present in those moments that matter when we're making decisions. Because if we come into a situation with the wrong framing, with our own bias, our own experiences, our own perspective on things, without information and facts and experiences of people who actually are in it, we're going to frame the problem wrong, and therefore all the approaches we take are going to be wrong. So just kind of encouraging that to take a growth mindset to this work, to take a growth mindset to who we are as people, so that we're not pigeonholing ourselves into always trying to be right, instead of trying to grow and be better and learn from each other.
So, good, Alex.
Yeah, Sheldon, if I can respond to that question as well. I think the vision a lot of us in this room probably have of that ideal single-family home, that has its lawn and two-car garage, sort of the Leave It to Beaver model of success in America. I think that's going to be dying out. I think we're going to increasingly see a shift toward multifamily, for many reasons, one of which is resilience, another is affordability. And if you look at the demographics, I don't spend a lot of time reading about demographics, but my sense is that millennials don't care as much about that, 20th century vision of the ideal home. They care more about a walkable community. They don't care whether they own or rent. They want to be in a stronger community where they can walk to the coffee shop, where they can, chat with their friends. They can, walk to a nearby restaurant. So I think the paradigm is going to be shifting, and I think it'll take a while to die out as some of us that, have grown up with that ideal die off. But I think we'll see a change, and we'll be more willing to accept rentals as an ideal.
Yeah, Alex, I think you're spot on. I'm doing the quick Google. Millennial home ownership is at a record low in the U.S. right now, and there's a multitude of reasons for that. And I see that in my community as a dense city. Frankly, there's been that shift from multifamily homes and then turning them into condos, right? And there's still that sense of community, but now we've got our own piece of the pie. When now there's a resurgence of we'd like to have the multifamily homes back so my parents can live above me, and there's some economy to that as well. And it's an interesting sociological shift that, at least in my urban environment, I'm seeing less towards the single family house and more towards creative ways of building community in your smaller network, but also in a larger network. Yeah.
I have to
Please.
basically say that my question was not necessarily the single-family house, Leave It to Beaver.
Yeah.
It was much more about the structures in which we build our buildings, so multifamily, big projects, but the ability to own it, both in terms of your space, but your community space within it. So And the reason I ask about that ownership is because I think the millennials, you're absolutely right, don't own, but as they get older, ownership just happens to be a part of, we either pay rent or we pay our mortgage, and one invests into our place and the other doesn't. So you sort of, it's sort of what our structure of our economy is built around. In Europe, it's very different. So that was my real question was,
Gotcha.
do we bring equity back to our communities by allowing ownership? It was not at all intended to say,
So
the
I have a-
leave it to Beaver.
I have a question for the audience. How many of you have read The Case for Reparations? Raise your hand. Nope. One. Okay. I would recommend at a starter of this conversation that what you do is go and Google The Case of Reparations. I forget the name of the author.
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Yes. And take a look at that because it describes the way intentional racist housing policy has disinvested communities of color and created the kind of divides that we see today, the segregation and the institutional framework behind that. I'm not going to describe it because I'm not necessarily good at that, but I would recommend reading that first. The other question I have is how many of you have heard of real estate investment cooperatives?
That's what I was going to say. So
Yeah.
I don't have to say anything?
So you can talk about real estate investment cooperatives.
No, I'm going to let you do it because you keep doing that to me.
No, you're good. I'm done talking.
So real estate investment trusts in the traditional sense are usually opportunities for people with a lot of money to pool their money together to invest in these large infrastructure, or not infrastructure, but real estate properties. The cooperative version of it breaks it down into smaller pieces so that folks can pool their money to be able to make these types of investments into real estate properties. That's the most simple way to talk about it. But real estate cooperatives at a kind of even smaller level, I think there's a huge opportunities there as we think about how do we put power back into communities. There are communities all over the country who are doing this work already around building cooperative housing developments in their communities. And what they need is more support, more thinking around the issues, more creative ways of financing these things. So I think Africatown in Seattle is a good example of that type of thinking and the community-driven approach to developing a property that benefits the community, that was driven by the community, and then the government came later and said, let us help you with that. But ultimately, in those earlier stages, they did a lot of outreach to try to think about the design of how they were going to do that project in their community. And so there's lots of opportunities, I think, for planners and designers to kind of take the groups, all those acronyms you mentioned earlier, who were going out and doing these projects, to also make sure that folks are thinking about what are some of these other cooperative models that communities want to see in their neighborhoods to be springing up. And some of them aren't these large mega developments or in that are traditional ways of thinking about density. What are some alternative ways to think about density? Because the reason people don't like density, when they hear the word, they think high rise, right? And they think, downtown, my neighbor's gonna look like downtown, right? And so what are helping folks also see, like, what are some of the alternative ways that we can build more density? Because the big challenge we're having, in addition to the wealth piece, is we just don't have enough housing for everybody. And Boston is one of the most densely concentrated cities in the country, and we're only 44 little square miles, and we have over 700,000 people living there. It doubles every day, sometimes triples, depending on the tourism season time. And we're projected to grow another 100,000 people. We don't have enough space to put all those people.
Yeah, I live in the 4 square miles next to your 44, and we got 80,000, so there's a lot going on.
They're high on that list, too. I think
Yeah.
you guys are above us in being densely populated.
It is. Yeah. I didn't want to claim that publicly, but here we are.
Add just one more thing.
Yeah, of course.
There's an article in Building Green that I wrote called Embracing the Economy as a Design Challenge. I'd love it if you in particular would take a look at it, but anybody else who's interested in this topic. And there's a woman, Marjorie Kelly, who wrote a book around ownership. Somebody else might remember the name of her book. But she and I talked about one of the things she's interested in is creating communities of practice around things like this. And I'm very interested if there are folks in the architecture field or anywhere in the building field who are interested in this conversation, to be in that conversation with folks who are developing these new models to see what kind of synergies could exist.
So the only thing I'm going to call you at, so embracing the economy as a design challenge is a pay-for-only article.
That's his fault.
That's a separate conversation. Okay, Sheldon, do you have the mic? Because I think Ludmila would like to say something. You can read it, but you have to pay for it.
I can send it to you.
Or you can come to the UMass library and you can read it for free, because we have a subscription to Building Green, and if you live in the state of Massachusetts, you can come, or even if you don't, anybody in the public can just come into the library. It's a Commonwealth resource.
Excellent.
And you can read that article.
It's about
on
building community and
PCs.
using resources.
I wanted to take Atiya's point about giving power to marginalized communities and flip it a little bit on the other side of AIA and architects in general serving power, because capital is power. And we often build capital projects, which are investments of large amounts of money that have been gathered through means, and position and money is power. And all the majority, actually, of the work that architects do is in service to that power. So how do we challenge power is the real question for me. If you could help me with that, that would be great.
You want to go? So it's my favorite thing to do since I was a kid. So I think, first of all, understanding power is important to be able to challenge it. So one of the things that I've done, and I've seen with being inside of government, is folks don't intend to do it, but it's never about intentions, right? But what ends up happening is folks just keep doing what has been done, right? So, you just do what we've always done to build into the planning process and then the development process to do stuff. And when we're doing what we've been doing, we just continue to make things worse. And so one of the approaches that has been helpful for me is to say, hey, so we have this RFP panel for this project, and you've invited me to sit on it. I'm happy to sit on it. But who's developing the criteria for how we're looking at these projects? And I'll go, oh, well, we were just some random person over here. Well, maybe we can do that collectively as a group so that we can come up with some interesting ways of thinking about this project, and maybe it can be something that can be used for the future. Oh, okay. So sometimes just by asking questions differently, you force people to have to think about it differently. So some of it's in the framing, and I think the more we understand the issues that the power is struggling with, because the power we're talking about really is just made up of a bunch of people. And those people are pressed for time, money, and resource and other types of resources. And so a lot of it isn't just because people are evil and there's like some guy behind the curtain, like, Wizard of Oz-ing us. So the more that we can resonate with or connect with the getting people out of their usual ways of thinking, the better. So the way the questions get asked, and also having multiple strategies, an inside and an outside strategy. So the more we can have folks who are inside government who understand the importance of equity and understand the importance of resilience and all these pieces that we can connect with, they can work it from the inside. And from the outside, we can be pushing, using similar language, using similar pressure points, so that when eventually, it's like having kids, right? If you say the same thing over and over and over again, eventually, like, it sinks into their brain, and one day they're an adult and they just say something back to you that you're like, oh, I said that to you before when you were a kid. You actually remembered that.
Is that true?
No, you tell me. She's not there yet. You have to talk to our older kids. Yeah. She's still in the indoctrination process. But, so kind of just, thinking creatively about how we can leverage all of the tools we have available to us to shift the thinking as well as influence the behavior, because that's really what we're trying to get is the behavior shift. So hopefully that's helpful.
So I'm going to ask Lindsay to answer this because we are a regional conference right now here, but many would say you are in the seat of power in Washington at the AIA. How do you challenge that organization?
So I would actually say that my role is most challenged by all of you. I like to hear from members and say, what is it that you're struggling with? What are your questions? Because the tools and resources and education that I'm creating along with your expert peers, they don't do any good if they don't address the questions you're seeing in the field. So it's really important that we hear your voices and hear your concerns and that you participate in creating this future that we all hope will be better.
So what is your greatest challenge within the national organization right now? You can plead the fifth. That's fine. I'm just curious. To do the work that you do.
Just capacity. I mean, we've talked about it today. The challenges are big. They're broad. And, there's a lot that we need to accomplish as a profession to make sure that our communities can thrive. And, our team is 2 people at National. And we work with great members all the time that are experts, that are giving us great advice, but they're also volunteers. They have a 9 to 5. As a collective, this needs to be an all hands on deck approach.
So one of the things I had asked of the group when we had an earlier call was, what do you see as your greatest challenge to the work that you do? And one of the interesting things that you had answered with was, I'm sorry, I apologize. I think it was Jennifer. Hurricane amnesia.
Oh, yes.
That was you, yeah,
yes.
I apologize.
Yeah, from a disaster assistance standpoint, absolutely hurricane amnesia.
Right, so the first one, and even in Alex's presentation, I'm getting everyone confused. It's been a busy day. I apologize. In your presentation earlier this morning, right, you had presented Harvey,
yes,
largest economic impact, and then there was Irma, and then there was Maria. So, there's a great response to the first, but...
But in Texas, they hadn't received a big hurricane on the coast in that area where Harvey hit in, I think, 47 years is what they were saying. In Florida had great disaster assistance work after Andrew. And, they had their three-peat around the Katrina timeframe, 2005, and then it's been pretty quiet since then. It's hard to talk about disaster preparedness and the need for mitigation when it's a beautiful sunny day outside. We're right here in Portsmouth. We live on the coast. We're going to go outside and sit by the ocean and enjoy our lunch, and we're not going to think about sea level rise, right? You kind of have to get a new mindset.
That's true, but at the same time, I've been really encouraged by watching the continuing response to Sandy in the New York City area. The rule of thumb used to be that you had about 2 years to effect change after some kind of event. And, they're still implementing stuff, after Sandy. The first phase of that, what had been called the Big U, now the dry line, I think it's called, this sort of berm around Lower Manhattan, that's beginning construction next year. They're continuing to focus on resilience, and I think that's huge.
And they have a chief resilience officer. He's awesome.
Yeah. I'm going to let Vada have the last question. And Sheldon's going to give you the mic, because we've got about 5 minutes.
So I guess the other question is, speaking of amnesia, when you live in a place where there are actually very visible reminders on a day-to-day basis of your previous encounters with hurricanes. So I live in Providence, and all buildings have markers on them.
And I mispronounced your name. It's Veda.
It's Veda.
I always have to think about Darth Vader, but like in a New England kind of way. So my apologies.
There's a lot of letters.
Veda.
Nobody knows how they make sense together. It's okay.
Back to your question.
So living in a place where there's these, there's visible reminders. We have a hurricane barrier. We have markers on buildings that when, we walk by, the water came into 6 feet, came to 10 feet. There's actually a lot of revisiting of the conversation. We also have parts of the state like Newport where, every time it rains a couple inches, people have major flooding events because of sea level rise already. And so and we're in it and trying to figure out strategies, how to move forward and have discussions with the communities, also knowing at the same time that I see some of the barriers that have been put in place to stop that and realize that the part of the city that they cut off are the part that are populated by our most vulnerable peoples, right? And so these are people who everything is going to be wiped away when the ocean comes in. We're going to be sitting high and dry in the more affluent communities, the more privileged communities. And so how do we change some of those conversations? But it's hard to, it's a visible reminder every day that we're with, and we see like very direct infrastructure that's been put in place that separates the community with a barrier. So I guess part of it is how do we keep the conversation going and expand it throughout the region and learn from others in the region and what they're doing and bring it into our cities. And a question to Lindsay, which is the programs that you're talking about, I had never heard of them, and it's really interesting to know like who is getting engaged with them and how is the AA reaching out to us in our community.
So that's a bigger issue because RUDAT was started in 1983, 84, right? So these have been around a long time. So to break down the question is how, when the barriers are visual, how do you break them down? And the second part was within the...
A question for all of us, how do we find out how we can get engaged
Okay.
with those?
Sure. So from the engagement method, I mentioned an opportunity in the presentation earlier today on ai.org/resilience. There is our Resilience Network that is open to all AIA members. Under member groups, it just says Resilience Network. Click there, and there's a brief form to fill out to learn a little bit more about you, your interests, what you would like to participate on, what sort of opportunities you're looking for. And that network is really an opportunity to talk with your peers across the country who are doing work like this, and then also to share knowledge. And AIA does add updates to that as well about specifically the resilience program. We're also on Twitter at AI_resilience. And then every other Friday, believe it or not, in your inbox is AI Architect. That's an email listserv from National that will share news from across the Institute with you. And I can tell you, I'm guilty. I was an AIA member long before I became a staff member, and I don't remember ever opening that email. So check your emails on Fridays. It might be there.
Okay. We've got about 3 more minutes left. Anyone want to take this on? Yeah?
Just to add in this whole piece you mentioned around marginalized groups kind of being pushed into areas that are less safe, that are more vulnerable. And it brings up the issue of power. Someone earlier, I can't remember who said it, sorry. Someone earlier mentioned that power was about money, capital, right? That's one form of power that's interrelated to a number of other forms of power. And the other form of power is decision-making. Who gets to decide? Right. And usually it's communities who have more resources and who have more time equity to be able to advocate and show up in spaces in the middle of the day to the hearings and things like that that other folks who in working class communities don't have the capacity to do. So just as we think about power in all of its dimensions, it's also about decision making and whose voices actually gets heard and who has the opportunities to actually have their voices heard. Then the other way is standards, how we think about what the norm is, right? So, and part of it, it's one of the things that creates the divides that leads to these segmented ways of looking at issues, because if we thought of the issues in the way they really are happening to us, which is it is hurting all of us, and the decisions that we make can benefit and harm different people differently. So if we're being honest about that, then the way we even do decision making would be very different. in government and in how communities advocate, and even in the planning and design process, and how we're doing community engagement to get feedback and input from communities. Because the people who show up are the folks who have privilege to show up, regardless of what their race is, right?
Alex, Jennifer?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, one thing we can all do is to engage locally. Join your local planning commission, run for the city council, get engaged with community action organizations. There's a lot that we can do, and you'd be surprised how influential an individual can be by engaging with these institutions. I was on our local planning commission for about 12 years in our little town in southeastern Vermont, and you can start these conversations and get people thinking about how to create more equitable housing. We should all try to engage locally and put our mouth where our minds are, and get effect change in your local community. It all starts locally.
Excellent point. You're going to be my closer.
Oh dear. I guess the thing that's been running around in my head is this thing about time equity that you've been talking about, and then listening to Alex, and then thinking again about social solidarity and about the work we do to engage others outside our immediate networks to understand what those real challenges are, and then bring that back when we have the time and ability into the spaces that Alex is talking about. So that you're not just speaking for yourself, you're also being a channel when you can, and also supporting other people in being able to step up when they can.
Excellent. So I want to thank you all for being a part of this. You've expanded my understanding of what this is. And I think I'm going to be a better practitioner, a better architect, a better citizen, a better mother, and a better community member as a result of this. So on behalf of myself, thank you, but also the audience. So well done.